This podcast represents the opinions of our hosts and their guests only. The content here should not be taken as medical advice and is for informational purposes only. And because each person is so unique, please consult your healthcare professional for any medical questions. Welcome to Once Shattered, Picking Up the Pieces, a podcast devoted to changing the way eating disorders and mental illness are viewed in our society. With your hosts, Jack and Linda Major and Ellen Bennett. Today's guest is Jacqueline Patmore. Jackie Patmore's involvement in the eating disorders field spans multiple roles of researcher, educator, clinician, and patient advocate. Before occupying these roles, she developed anorexia as an elite volleyball player when she was 14 years old, which ignited her desire to enter the field. As a patient, Jackie was subject to care that lacked an evidence base, was nearly impossible to access, and was void of cultural sensitivity. Early awareness of these and other gaps in treating and understanding eating disorders drove her to harness her own experience, education, and professional pursuits to improve conditions and treatment options for eating disorder sufferers. As a researcher at the Washington University in St. Louis School of Medicine, Jackie helped to establish Interpersonal Psychotherapy, IPT, as a primary treatment for eating disorders, depression, and anxiety in university clinics nationwide. Jackie has advocated to increase insurance and federal coverage of eating disorder treatments, and she has lectured and taught course sections at Columbia University's Hunter College and NYU. She is currently a PhD candidate at Columbia University's Clinical Psychology program and manages the Somatic Expressions of Pain Lab, supervising master's students on research initiatives related to sexual abuse, trauma, substance abuse, self-injury, and eating disorders. Her lab has presented at international conferences and published studies related to lying and deception about issues of treatment and body image in treatment, cultural considerations for the treatment of eating disorders, and the use of peer supports in the treatment of eating disorders. You can read Jackie's full bio along with links for this episode in the show notes.
Welcome, everyone, to Once Shattered, Picking Up the Pieces, episode 115. Athlete with anorexia, now researcher, clinician, educator, PhD candidate, Jackie Patmore. She will be joining us in just a minute. We have such a heartwarming, inspirational podcast for you today with Jackie. And let me begin by a quote with Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. I'd also like to welcome the handsome guy sitting next to me, my husband and my soulmate, Jack Major.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're sorry that Ellen can't be with us today. She's attending the funeral out of state of a relative, and our condolences go out to her and her family, and she will be back at our next podcast.
We miss you already, Ellen.
Always.
Mm-hmm. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our very dear and special guest. She is driven all the way from New York City to be in the studio with us today. I'm honored to welcome Jacqueline Patmore, PhD candidate and very, very special friend.
Oh, well, hi, Linda and Jack. It's such a pleasure to be with you both today. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
We're honored to have you.
Oh, just, the fact that you made the 5-hour trip to be here with us is just so special. So special.
Pleasure.
So can you tell our listeners how Linda and I first met you and about why you took the time to reach out with us with that first email?
Yeah, well, I first met you and Linda about, I think, 3 years ago now when you came to speak in our class at Columbia. It was a course on eating disorders, one of the last that I took in graduate school, and we were assigned to read your book, Emily, the story of a girl and her family hijacked by anorexia. And I just remember being so touched by your story and by both of you, having experienced the illness myself, having my parents, experience this illness with me. There aren't a lot of people who get it, but both of you certainly do. And not only that, but I really wanted to let you know that your story matters, and it made an impact. It made a difference. And even if it was just me reaching out, even if it was just one person in training, I wanted to let you know that I will be taking your story. I'll be taking Emily's story with me as I progress through my training and my work with patients, with research. There were so many moments in the book where you could tell and you could experience the hopelessness and the inability to really do anything as a parent. And, you know, my parents were there too. I was there too. And I'm part of the reason I'm in this field is hopefully to use my story, to use yours, to bring the patient perspective in, and just needed to tell you guys that I would be wrapping Emily's story up with mine and so many others. And the way that I tried to educate, be helpful, just really put people first. And so it just really made it made a big impact. Also, just as a kid who went through it with loving parents who were there with her along the way, I felt really inclined to let you know that I was that girl kicking and screaming. I was that girl pushing everyone away, not wanting help because I wanted so desperately to keep my illness. And during those times, it wasn't me. That was my eating disorder. And the way that my parents loved me through that, very similar to the way that you loved Emily through those moments, that really matters. And there was nothing and no one that could rip that disorder away from me. And, the circumstances were different. I feel like if the wind had been blowing differently, my story would have been Emily's. And I just think it was so important for me to tell you that, while Emily can't be here, while so many others can't be, and I would never dream to speak for her, know what she might say, but it just, you loved her so profoundly and so well and did so much. And reading your book, reading your words, it was so evident how thoughtful you were in everything that you did. And treatment for eating disorders isn't great, but being there with someone, loving someone, you can do that well. And I really don't know that you could have done that much better. So just wanted to share that with you.
I can't tell you how your emails have touched us, and they're just very special, and you are very special, and your future in psychology is incredible, and you have already touched so many people already, so many beautiful, wonderful experiences, and it takes very special people to become psychologists, and especially to specialize in eating disorders, because it can be challenging. But I applaud you for doing that. And I think your intelligence, your sensitivity, and your compassion and your drive are the perfect combination of things. And you will just help so many people, and you already have, and that will continue. And we just feel very blessed to know you and feel that you were heaven sent to us. Your personality was very much like Emily. So
yeah, very much so. I cried 3 years ago reading the email, and I'm crying now. Listening to you talk, but thank you so much for those kind words. And the reason we wrote the book was to help people understand, get the awareness out there, and increase the education of the medical community, and have more people like you focus on eating disorders, because, as you know, and it's just it's exploding. It was there before COVID, and it's certainly ramped up over 100%, since COVID. So,
well, your story is one of hope, yes. And we're all about hope. The reason that we're doing this is because we have hope for others, and there is a lot of hope, and things are getting better. And it's also very hard to have a story out there that's so personal, because not everybody will get it. But I do believe we all need a village of people who get it, mm-hmm. to help us through whatever it is we're going through. So can you share more about your story and being an elite athlete and developing anorexia? Most people have no idea how prevalent eating disorders are in athletes and how insidious an eating disorder can begin.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think a lot of people don't know that athletes are at particularly high risk for developing eating disorders. Athletes can have perfectionistic personality types, a fear of failure. They can have these inaccurate beliefs about the ways that low body weight drives performance. Winning becomes kind of everything. Performance becomes everything. Coaches focus on those elements rather than the whole person. With athletics, there can also be a belief about driving your body and pain being beneficial. And all of those things were very much at play. For me, when I developed an eating disorder at 14, I was an elite volleyball player in a pretty intense club and was subject to a pretty toxic coach and sports environment. It was, a place that pushed us to be the absolute best, and that meant to be perfect and keep food journals and have frequent weigh-ins and so many demanding and damaging behaviors. And I was always a little bit of a people pleaser and a rule follower, and I kind of just followed the rules a little bit too well in that instance. And not only that, eating disorders are about so much more than just strict rules or about one thing or another. It was really the ways that those behaviors and that sense of control and rigidity mixed in with some sadness and fear, the uncertainty of being just an anxious and perfectionistic kid. And this finally led to a very significant weight drop in a short amount of time, and eventually anorexia. And interestingly, at the time, no one really seemed to notice. I got a lot of praise. There was that belief I had mentioned of lower weight leading to better performance and being able to jump higher and run faster. And eating disorders work for a very short while. There's this tiny moment where everything seems like it's so much better, than it all crashes and burns, and it's not that way at all. But yeah, what ended up happening is me being hospitalized, and I was really lucky in being able to receive treatment almost immediately. I think my eating disorder was well contextualized within this elite volleyball athlete persona. So removing myself from that was really instrumental. And I was able to get care. It wasn't perfect care, but I feel very fortunate in terms of just the timing of how it happened, because even though my eating disorder was, pretty short-lived comparably to others, it left a significant impact. There's always going to be a bend in the plastic there. And I can't imagine years and years and years of that compounding on one another, and the strength with which it takes hold is really quite unbelievable. But yeah.
Where were you living at that time?
Yeah, I was living in Chicago, Illinois.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, big city, a lot of medical care there. And yeah. So you answered my next question. You answered some of it just now. As parents who've lost a child to anorexia and are trying to change the access to care, and the access to care is there, it's the quality of care and getting the insurance companies to provide better coverage with eating disorders. And we know firsthand how easily it is for somebody to fall through the cracks of that system. So you did share some of your experiences with us. I know there's been countless articles, and we've talked to people over the last couple of years that have been on this podcast about there's a crisis in America with treatment of anorexia nervosa specifically, and how treatment hasn't changed in 30 years. So is it through education of the medical community and then subsequently to disseminate that to the insurance industry, or does it have to be policy changes? I'm just at a loss of how to get things changed.
It's such a big question, and one that I am constantly asking myself. I went into this work from the patient perspective. I thought, I was a kid with an illness. No one was listening to me. Everything I said was, "Oh, that's your eating disorder." It felt very lonely, and I felt very discredited as a human with an opinion and a personality and a brain. And it's tricky. This illness can be very insidious and very difficult to understand and very deceptive. But I knew even at 14, there's something that's not totally right going on around me. I knew that my counselor at my treatment center was just out of school. I knew that she wasn't an eating disorder specialist in a lot of different ways. I knew that the majority of my treatment was activities, and you totally have to fill that time with something. But there were just gaps, and I didn't have an awareness of exactly how my experience was indicative of the gaps in treatment, but I knew that it wasn't great. And so with that and kind of setting out, I really tried to do as much research as I could, really tried to understand what is this illness, what is available. It really fueled me into my psychological and research career pretty early on. I've always known I wanted to do this, and being on the research side, seeing how interventions are developed, it's amazing work, and there are brilliant people doing it. The thing is that when you do a research study, you are dealing with a very limited population, in that if you're testing one treatment for one illness, you have to make sure it's just the illness, right? So there's an exclusion criteria. You can't have the anxious, depressed, self-harming anorectic. You have to have just the sole illness, right? If this treatment works for this condition in an experimental, way, we need to be able to isolate those variables. So what happens in the real world, where as a provider now in my career, I've never seen someone with an eating disorder not have something else, anxiety, depression, other things.
The comorbidities that go,
they're endless. And so you have this treatment and it kind of works. Like the outcomes from that, I think our best number in the data is like family-based treatment for anorexia for adolescents is maybe 40%. And that's like our best shot at this thing. But when you translate that into clinical practice and you bring it to providers, one, you're not going to disseminate that training, that care in the way that reflects the manual and the way that reflects the science. Two, people are going to take a more integrative approach, which they absolutely should, but then you're not using that scientific method that was said to be this effective for this person. And at baseline, not everyone is even doing that. I think there's like 30% of providers who use evidence-based methods on a frequent basis. So that's just a long way to go from where the treatment develops in a very research-supported manner to the way it's disseminated and implemented in ways that just have a lot of gaps. And it's a tough illness. It's, what's out there there's a lot of room to improve.
Yeah. I read an article the other day, and it said only 6% of medical schools in the United States have any eating disorder courses, that people need to take to graduate. And again, that blew me away. And so thank you. And we need more people specializing in this. We just do, to understand it and specialize in this, just like we have specialists for diabetes and hypertension and all the other, diseases out there. So we'll get there one step at a time. It's, as they say, it's a tall mountain to climb, but we're going to keep climbing.
Yeah. And you mentioned a little bit about the insurance coverage. So just wanted to speak to that. There are interventions out there that work, that can be accessed. And when I was struggling, our listeners can't see me. I'm 6 feet tall, but I did not fit the typical mold of the anorexic patient. And my weight criteria wasn't such that I was able to get extended coverage or an extended period of time there. I think I had about 2 weeks covered total. And then they were like, you know what? Congratulations. You crossed the weight criteria. Your eating disorder is completely gone and you're fine.
You're all better.
All better. I think that's so problematic in the way that patients experience this illness. When you have an eating disorder, you already feel broken. You already feel like you're a burden. And I remember at that 2-week mark, my parents, who, are not from this country, have worked so hard, done absolutely everything so I could have a wonderful and full and an experience full of opportunities. They drained their retirement. They sacrificed absolutely everything in a way that still impacts all of us today. But when you're that sick and then your family is putting in all of these resources to try to help save you, there's this feeling of like, I'm not worth it, just let me go. Like, it's not, this is too much. And that feeling is already so much a part of this illness that the way that the lack of coverage plays with that is so dangerous and so hindering to the process of getting well or to feeling like you even deserve to be well.
Wow, that's just devastating. I have a question for you, but I just want to go back to something in Jack's question about cultural sensitivity. Must have been very difficult for your family, just of course it was as parents to see you going through this, but can you tell me what some of the cultural challenges were?
Yeah, absolutely. So my mom is from Colombia, from South America, and my dad is English. So very different cultural pieces coming together there. But neither of them grew up here. Their medical systems are very different in that they actually provide pretty comprehensive care when people get sick. And they hadn't really had to navigate that domain in any sort of real way until I became ill. And they were just shocked that, one, we went to the doctor and the doctor, my pediatrician just seemed to have more questions than answers. And we just kept getting a series of referrals and it was very aimless and very confusing at a time when we were all very desperate and very scared. And of course we just trusted whomever, right? It's a doctor. They're telling you this thing in this course of treatment. So, if you have cancer, there's a doctor for that and a course of care. And then, you decide what you're doing and your chances are what they are. But with this, it just seemed like there was no definitive path. And there was a little bit of, like the language, the system, all of these different things made it even more difficult. And it's difficult at baseline for any family to navigate. But I think something that treatment missed and continues to miss sometimes is the way that culture really interacts with food and body. Your body, the way that you interact with food, it's so ingrained in terms of the culture that you come from. And food can mean community, food can mean safety, food can mean family, food can mean
love,
absolutely. It can mean so many things. The way that we see our bodies, experience our bodies is so culturally entrenched. For me, I was always the very tall, strange, like Latina, Latinx person. I never fit into either side of my family. And that played a huge part in my identity being up for grabs and my eating disorder claiming that space. And that was never explored in treatment, even though I think it was a huge part of what got me to the point where this volleyball environment clicked with some predispositions and that eating disorder developed. So in terms of access to care, just not understanding the system, not really having a lot of resources, period, but then certainly ones that could help people navigate the system who didn't have familiarity with it. And then in the way that my eating disorder developed, as far as, looking at some of those cultural pieces, that was very much not a part of my experience.
So though the medical treatment that you received and the conditions that they were provided in certainly weren't perfect or ideal, you survived and you are thriving, but that doesn't discount the fact that you and your parents traveled down a very rocky, scary road together that challenged everything. Can you tell us a little bit more about your parents? And I'm sure that there were a few medical clinicians that impacted you in a positive way too. Can you tell us about them? And if there was a pivotal moment in your illness when things began to shift?
Yeah. So as far as the treatment, and I don't mean to cast, in such a negative light on what's available. There's so many amazing researchers, so many incredible providers, particularly in my educational training.
But not everybody has access to that.
Not
right?
everyone has access to that. Exactly. So there were definitely some clinicians, who it wasn't even their eating disorder expertise. It wasn't even, any particular technique or strategy. It was their ability to just sit with me and their ability to just see me and ask me about something rather than telling me, this is what your eating disorder is about, or that's just your eating disorder's voice. And I think that in clinical practice is the most important intervention you can possibly do, whether it's depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, eating disorders, just being able to hold space with someone and accompany them. This illness is so, so lonely, and there's so much shame and so much misinterpretation that to just be able to see the person underneath the illness really does make all the difference. There's an incredible researcher at Washington University in St. Louis, where I ended up studying, and I think a lot of the people who have kept me well and inspired me have been teachers and more later on in my career, fortunately and maybe unfortunately for my younger self. But her name is Rebecca Lester. She's an incredible person. She also has lived experience. She talks about the intersections of culture and eating disorders. And she really made an impact in the way that she shared her story, and the way that she taught her class, and the way that she provides care. And early role models like that, I think, inspired me probably more than maybe an intervention earlier on made an impact in my ability to get well. I think what the moment that strikes when you say that, and it's not some beautiful aha moment of, wow, I love my body now, or I feel this love or this sense of peace that I hadn't before. I got really pissed. I was angry. I was a kid, and I looked around and I just got really upset, and I experienced my fellow patients kind of going through something similar. And yeah, there were some lovely people. This work is hard, and to commit yourself to it requires a really special heart. And I don't want to discredit that. But I think what happened with me was I'm a very stubborn person. And when I set my mind on something, there's really not a lot that can separate me from it. And there was just a moment in treatment where I was like, you know what? I don't know that I can do anything about this now. No one is going to listen to me. No one's even listening to me about my own illness, about my own body, about my own mind. But maybe if I can do something with this, if I can have the education, have the degree, have the position, I can do something. I can, maybe improve this. I don't know how. And still, decades later, I don't have the answers, but that mission, I think, really saved my life. And there are a lot of years of having to grapple with my work and my research and my practice being connected to this personal story. I don't think that one should just have their recovery be entrenched in that. You need to recover for yourself and then draw from that to help other people. You cannot give from an empty well. But I think that initial sort of spark in me as a kid, and that curiosity and that determination, it really did save my life. Yeah.
It's beautiful. Just beautiful.
So we're very curious to hear about your research when you were at Washington University at the St. Louis School of Medicine, especially the IPT, the Interpersonal Psychotherapy, and the different ways it's being used to help patients with eating disorders and other mental health conditions. So can you enlighten us on IPT?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So when I was at WashU, I was a researcher there and was in charge of a project that disseminated interpersonal psychotherapy to university, college, counseling centers. The cool thing about IPT is that I think it's an intersection between a very behaviorally driven intervention and more of a relationship, symbolic driven intervention. With eating disorders, CBT is our gold standard, right? Cognitive behavioral therapy. For some patients who are extremely ill, you need a straight up behavioral intervention. You need to be refed and renourished. regardless of sort of how you think or feel about that in the beginning before you're able to uptake any other treatment options. But at some point, some patients, not everyone, is they would benefit from IPT. So what IPT is, it was developed by this pair of researchers, Klerman and Wiseman, in the 1970s. Originally, it was a treatment for depression, and they adapted it for patients with eating disorders. And what it does is it really looks at the eating disorder symptoms as they emerge within a social system. We're all creatures that are in relationships, and our communities are really important. The ways that we define ourselves in those communities really matters. Food is highly contextualized in communities. Our bodies are highly contextualized within communities. So what IPT does is it looks at your relationships currently. It asks about some relationship patterns in the past, and it really raises the question of, given that this is the way that you relate to others and others relate to you, and you think about yourself, how does that influence the way that your eating disorder shows up? And not just eating disorder, whatever symptoms, but for eating disorders, really looking at, how does it play with those particular symptoms? And I like it because it's time limited, so you can do it, you can do it in 12 sessions, you can do it in 20 sessions. There have been pilots of 3 to 5 sessions. So it's not forever. It's time limited, which I think is great with things like insurance coverage and maybe more limited abilities to give longer term care. And there are behavioral components. There are homework assignments. There are ways that you engage in your environment. There are ways that you use the therapeutic space to, create situations that the patient can then apply in their lives. But it's also highly symbolic. It's culturally sensitive. It really wants to get to know the patient and their backgrounds and their relationships. And it's a really beautiful intervention if it's done well. And it is manualized. It is research-based. But I really love some of the ways that it kind of crosses those lines as well.
So you said it started in the 70s?
Yep, it started in the 70s.
When was it used for eating disorders? When did they start doing that?
That was, so while I was at WashU, I'm most familiar with, I guess, the literature that adapted it into a group setting, particularly for patients with binge eating disorder. Denise Wolfley did that work maybe a decade and a half ago or so, but it's been adapted and played with. Chris Fairburns, Stuart Agris did some interventions looking at it, comparing it to CBT, but here and there, different groups have kind of pulled out pieces of it or done different forms of it with eating disorders. And it's been shown over time to have really similar effects to cognitive behavioral therapy, which is exciting.
That's great.
That's great, yeah.
So you are currently a PhD candidate at Columbia University's Clinical Psychology program, and you manage the Somatic Expressions of Pain Lab, supervising master's students on research initiatives to sexual abuse, trauma, substance use, self-injury, and eating disorders. It must be such a privilege to work with the master's students and develop the research initiatives that have the potential to help patients develop skills to rebuild their lives after such traumatic events. When I hear the term somatic pain, I think about the phrase, the issues are in our tissues. Can you explain a little bit about the mind-body connection for us and tell us about this research?
Sure. And I want to preface this with the fact that the mind-body connection is so important, and that can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. I have one very specific lens that I do my research from, so I'm still learning a lot more about it, but just want to caveat what I say with that, because there's so much amazing work on what that means, and my lab does it in a very specific way. So the way that we understand the mind-body connection is that sometimes things happen in the body, like sexual abuse, like physical abuse, like some sort of event. And as human beings, we have ways of processing that or expressing that or not, particularly as women. And we need research with all genders, all identity types. Our research specifically does focus on the feminine experience of people being in their bodies. So particularly as women historically, we haven't always had the ability to use words to communicate those types of events or things that happen in our bodies. There's something about the way that events get suppressed, about the way that events do not get disclosed or talked about, that causes them to fester internally. And what I'm interested in, what our group is interested in, is the way that sort of sits there and turns into different things and lets itself out as self-harm, as eating disorders, as substance use, as promiscuity, as using your body as a way to express things that you can't with words for whatever reason. So really looking at the body as its own way of disclosure, sort of this like body language type of idea. So that's pretty specifically sort of what we do. And really understanding eating disorders as a symbolic system of relating to the world, relating to your body, of trying to communicate something, maybe not on purpose, maybe to yourself, maybe to someone else, maybe to no one at all. But there is a lot of symbolism in this illness that I think can be missed, and people really define it in terms of one thing or another, a developmental disease or a psychological one or a physical one. And it can be all of those things and more. And because of the way that food and body is so personal, is so culturally ingrained, eating disorders are as different as every person who has them. And there are definitely similarities, and that helps us know how to treat certain components. But regardless of whatever form of treatment you're doing, if you don't understand who that person is, how they relate to their food and their body, you're missing a big piece of the puzzle.
Oh, beautifully said.
Yeah. And when you're saying it, it festers inside, it's like, there's a cancer in there, and if it's not addressed or treated, it just metastasizes, and it becomes so much worse. And so yeah,
I totally believe in that. I'm a Reiki master myself, and just the experience of doing that for people, it's amazing. Sometimes when people relax and are very relaxed, the things that they feel, or the places at the beginning where they're holding tension and they don't even realize it until they think about it. And when you think about trauma is something that is within you forever. And, it's difficult, I'm sure, but...
Well, the definition of trauma is different for everybody.
Right, but if you don't talk about it, and if it just manifests in your body, it's going to affect you. And if you can find healthy ways to express yourself with somebody who is trained and understands and has that compassion and can help you work through things, you can get your life back. And people do it, but it's got to be extremely hard. And, and what is trauma, right? For some people, what you think is a very small thing, could be trauma to them. It's so individualized. So I get that.
So I can't imagine working on a PhD. It's just, things you've told me in the papers you have to do. And, it's like, we wrote a book, and, you said, well, I kind of did too. So, but when you're finished, you're going to have so many options where you settle in. And again, it's evident how hard you worked and how much you've enjoyed the experience from your research, and clinician, educator, and patient advocate. And you even fit in advocacy for eating disorders to increase the insurance and federal coverage of eating disorders in Missouri, Texas, and New York. And I know when you reached out to us, 3 years ago, and you said you'd, do whatever you could to help us advocate for these changes. And so, you have any idea where you're going to end up when you're finished with the PhD? And do you like New York?
I love New York. I think it's a great city to study people in, for sure. And I've been really lucky to be here and to find myself in this program. It's been a lifelong dream. I knew and know that there is nothing else I could possibly do with my life than hold space with people and just, to be present with someone in their most vulnerable times, to have someone trust you, to be a thought partner with them, to accompany them. There's no greater honor to me as a human. And so definitely clinical work is a huge part of what I want to be doing. Eating disorders obviously have a really special place in my heart. And every time it's brought up in training, every time I've heard it talked about sort of casually, it's this thing of like, oh, well, that's a really tough population. You know, those patients are tricky. And yeah, you know, like as a former one myself, like I was a little bit of a terror. Like it really takes you over, but there's so much pain there, I think, is the thing that can be missed. And I'm not scared of it necessarily. The illness is frightening and it's powerful and it can take on a life of its own for sure. But to be able to tolerate that, to be able to understand and still be there and persist and try to reach the person underneath, that's always been my mission from the time I wished that had been a part of my treatment through, you know, how I have learned to do that with others. There's, you know, those are the moments that I know I'm here for a reason. And so certainly eating disorders will be a part of that. I think that's something that's been really important for me and something I try to advocate for in mentoring other students or talking about my experience is making sure that there is a separation from the eating disorders work. Your life is so defined by it when you're going through it. It defines your family. It defines everything about, you know, the way you think, the way you act, the way you feel. And there's something great about knowing that, okay, I can make something of this. It doesn't have to just be this sad and tragic thing that happened, but I deserve and patients deserve and families deserve to have space outside of that for themselves. And there were 5 years where I didn't do eating disorders at all. And I actually started my PhD doing something completely different, doing psychological program design, and very much just out of happenstance and I think a little bit of fate and divine intervention ended up back in this field. But I think a big part of my work will also just be a lot of different types of patient populations, some positive psychology interventions, some coaching, some just other things as well. I love teaching. It's one of my favorite things. I think the potential to make real change can lie in that capacity. And I definitely want to incorporate my experience, your experience. The book, Emily, Wherever I Teach, will be required reading for sure. So it's just things like that, sort of a variety of things. I also really believe in the research. I know that I was not born into this planet to be a researcher. Countless hours with some statistical software have shown me, you know, this is not necessarily my greatest gift, but I believe in thoughtful research. I believe in patient-centered research. A big part of what my lab also tries to do is access the client experience, look at peer forms of interventions for eating disorders, and staying involved in some capacity is important to me. And being able to have a way to integrate the research into the treatment is something I really care about and will hopefully continue to try to do.
Well, bless you. And I'm sure whatever direction you go in, you're going to be a huge success, and you already are. So, again, bless you for that.
Jackie, is there anything else we should know about you or that you want to share with us today?
Yeah, you know, I have shared my story on, you know, some platforms, and honestly, this one is by far the most meaningful, just sitting here with both of you and knowing your story and where you've been and the way we've been able to connect. And I think on other forums, I've been this shining example of recovery, and oh, how wonderful if only every patient could do that. Like,
and recovery is possible.
It is. Absolutely.
You know, that's why we're here, is to
certainly. Yeah. It certainly is. But it's also not so straightforward. It's also not so easy. It's not so perfect. When I became well, I did not just relinquish my perfectionistic, you know, overly obsessive, anxious tendencies.
You saw a little of that last night.
We share some. We share some.
Yeah, we all do.
Yeah, when we were looking at maybe some of the things we would talk about and creating some notes, I was like, oh, was there a spelling here? Did I accidentally misspell something? Typo? Couldn't be. So yes, I did not just magically become a different person. And it's unreasonable to assume that our society already has so much disordered eating, so already has so much, misperceptions about what bodies should be and all that pressure and everything. And at baseline, when I was healthy, I didn't love my body. Like I was a teenager and we're all subject to whatever pressures and, we all overeat a little bit. Like a lot of people diet. Like our culture is just flawed in this way pretty fundamentally. So if I started out as a normal, quote unquote normal, whatever that means, person, and then developed this illness that took those things and distorted them in such an extreme direction, it is unreasonable to assume that reverting back to, whatever normal means or my recovery could necessarily end up in this magical land where I eat cheeseburgers naked in front of a mirror and love my body. Like that isn't real life. And sometimes that perception of recovery as being this space where you don't have negative thoughts about yourself, where eating is just this joy, where you're using food as fuel. It can be real. It absolutely can be real. Oftentimes it's a little more complicated and, you really have to understand who you are, what your triggers are, how to manage those things, that anxiety, that perfectionism, those ingredients that went into the circumstance that, made my eating disorder flourish. And it's a lot of checks and balances. And there have been times where I've needed a little extra support. There have been times where, like that door is in the back of my mind as like, oh, hey, like there was this thing that took all your stress away. Like, remember that when you didn't need to feel anything and you didn't need love and everything was, under control and it lies to you. But it's, it happened. It's, my brain knows that that's a pathway that has these potential, not benefits, but misrepresentations of like good things that could occur. And yeah, I'm a human being. And I think this work and really knowing myself, having been in therapy, continuing to do therapy, like I will be a lifelong therapy attendant. I really believe in it. Those are the things that keep me well, but recovery is not just something that happens and is easy and that is consistently maintained perfectly at all times. So I always want to be very careful with my story. Because I do not want to present it as something that is unattainable. If, so just wanted to sort of kind of qualify everything with that.
Yeah. So we've been talking about cultures and I know, these are all statistics and 30 million people in the United States, suffer from an eating disorder. And we all know it's probably higher, and 70 million worldwide. So, your father's from England and your mom's from Colombia. And I know in England, that's a major issue. So in Colombia or South America, is it, prevalent that much too?
Yeah, it really is. I mean, for all sorts of reasons. And it occurs differently when people are in their country of origin versus if they, have come to this country and hold different cultural ideals and values. It just looks different. So I think at least, and I can speak as a Colombian woman with a lot of other stuff who does not live there. And, I don't represent everyone's experience, but I know for my relatives, for example, who are there are a lot more definitive gender roles to buy into the feminine ideal is a lot more extreme sometimes than it might be even in the United States. It means some similar things, maybe, to be docile, to be delicate, to be sort of made up. The sort of performative aspect is pretty prevalent in some, cultures and some situations in South America. And But the thing is, when we talk about eating disorders and the ways that we understand them, we come from a very specific frame of reference, right? Like even the diagnosis eating disorder, like we have the DSM, it's westernized. What is mental health or pathology or symptoms or abnormal behavior than a deviation from a norm? And our norm is our society. It's the thing that we decide is normal. So to say, hey, this deviation in our culture, how does that look in another culture? Well, they have a different baseline. Like we don't 100% know, and we can't pretend to sort of make that translation perfectly. So I think that a lot of the elements are there. I think as human beings, our bodies and food is symbolic. I think that it's something we interact with, 3 to 5 or more times a day. So if something's going on in our mind, the way that comes out is probably going to be somewhere in the way that we relate to food or body. But the way that each culture does that is a little bit different, even if there are some similarities between ways of, diagnosing them or understanding them. So, so I think it would really lie in understanding what is the baseline, how does that person relate to themselves, to other people around them, and how is their expression different or damaging or not functional comparatively. So it definitely is an issue worldwide. I think it gets missed because when we talk about research, when we talk about the illness, we're talking about our frame. We're using our tools to diagnose in other places, and I think a lot is missed.
But it's universal. It's a universal problem, and it's.
Do other countries have a DSM or something equivalent to that?
Yeah, so the ICD is what they use to diagnose there. It is still, I think, pretty highly westernized. And I think the interesting thing is when those cultures come here and the ideals are still, being carried from their countries of origin, and we sort of put them all under this little DSM umbrella and call it an eating disorder, and that can be really problematic as well. So in the same way that we think about, each person is a person, and we need to understand their background and their story and their culture, I think a cultural psychology approach should always be utilized with everybody, and that sensitivity is really important.
Mm-hmm. And I think therapy is such an important thing too. You alluded to that earlier, how you'll be a therapy recipient forever, and I think that's something that should start for our children when they're young, when they're in school. To meet with a therapist a few times a year. I think it's just a good thing to have another safe, trusting space, because sometimes people, especially children, don't share things with their parents, and there's things going on that people don't know about. And I think that a lot of what helps when someone is diagnosed with an eating disorder, though there's no perfect recipe, if you can catch it early on, there's much more chance for a full recovery. So, and your full recovery story is honest and beautiful, and you're brave, and we feel very blessed to be able to call you friend. And
you're brilliant.
Yes,
you're brilliant.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we're almost out of time, but thank you so much. And Emily sends you to us, and that makes you an Emily connection, and that's the most special thing. And Jack, you want to take it from here?
Yeah, again, Jackie, thank you so much for being our friend and coming here today. And it's a joy to meet you in person. Virtual was nice, but in person, it's great.
Can't beat it.
So, listeners, thank you for tuning in today, and please tell your friends and family about this podcast, because everybody's mental health matters. Please rate and review and share this podcast on the platform you're listening to it on. And we recently are also on YouTube as an audio podcast. So, Once Shattered, Picking Up the Pieces.
And we can't forget to thank Vox Recording and Production and sound engineer and producer extraordinaire, Scott Fitzgerald. He expertly produces our podcast and so much more. This is the place to record your podcast, record your audiobook, as we did, or do a legacy cast for your loved ones. Thank you, Scott.